Rain hammered against the frosted glass of Rose's brownstone when the frantic pounding began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the heavy, desperate thud of a man with nothing left to lose. Standing on her porch, drenched and swaying, was Chicago's most feared syndicate leader. He whispered 3 words. Midnight in Chicago usually brought a heavy, suffocating silence to Rose Bennett's neighborhood, broken only by the distant wail of a police siren. As a former ER trauma surgeon who had retreated to a quiet private practice, Rose cherished that silence. She had spent the last 14 months trying to erase the adrenaline-fueled chaos of the hospital, pouring her energy into a mundane routine. But the city had a way of refusing to let the past stay buried. The knocking started at 1:14 a.m. It was a violent, rhythmic pounding that rattled the hinges of her solid oak front door. Rose froze in her kitchen, her half-empty mug of chamomile tea suspended halfway to her lips. She set the mug down silently, the ceramic clinking softly against the granite countertop. Creeping into the hallway, she reached for the heavy brass flashlight she kept on the console table. She pressed her eye against the cold brass of the peephole. The porch light was flickering, casting erratic, harsh shadows over the man slumped against her doorframe. He wasn't a random vagrant, nor was he a lost neighbor. Even through the distorted glass lens, Rose recognized the sharp, patrician jawline and the broad shoulders straining against a ruined, soaked Brioni suit. It was Dominic Russo. A cold spike of pure terror nailed Rose to the floorboards. Dominic Russo was not a man who knocked on front doors. He was the head of the Russo Syndicate, a ghost in the city's underworld who controlled everything from the docks of Lake Michigan to the back rooms of City Hall. Rose only knew him because 2 years ago, she had been the surgeon forced at gunpoint to extract a 9mm hollow point bullet from his shoulder in a condemned warehouse. She had saved his life, kept her mouth shut, and walked away with a briefcase of cash she had immediately donated to a free clinic. She had prayed never to see his face again. The knocking resumed, weaker this time. Then, a voice, gravelly and slurred, bled through the heavy wood. Rose opened the door. Her medical instincts warred with her survival instincts. Survival told her to call Detective Harrison, the only clean cop she knew. Medicine told her the man outside was minutes away from collapsing. With a shaking hand, she undid the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. Dominic nearly fell face first into the foyer. Rose caught him instinctively, groaning under the sudden, massive weight of him. He felt like a furnace, radiating unnatural heat, and the stench of top-shelf bourbon and rain-soaked wool immediately filled her pristine hallway. "Dominic?" she gasped, struggling to keep him upright as she kicked the front door shut and locked it. "What are you doing here? Are you out of your mind?" He didn't answer with his usual sharp, intimidating cadence. Instead, his head lolled against her shoulder. His dark hair, usually impeccably styled, was plastered to his forehead in wet, chaotic strands. "I need you," he mumbled, his breath hot against her neck. Couldn't go home? Rose practically dragged him into the living room, letting him collapse onto her beige linen sofa. She didn't care about the water or the dirt staining the fabric. She immediately went into triage mode. She grabbed his face, forcing his chin up. His eyes, usually a piercing, calculating grey, were bloodshot and unfocused. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the irises completely. "You're drunk," Rose stated, her voice tight with disbelief and anger. "You risked blowing my cover, bringing your enemies to my doorstep, because you had too much to drink?" Dominic let out a harsh, broken laugh that dissolved into a violent coughing fit. He grabbed her wrist with startling strength, his grip bruising. "Not drunk," he rasped, fighting to focus his eyes on her face. "Poisoned. The scotch. Matteo. He served it." Rose's heart stopped. Matteo was Dominic's underboss, his right-hand man. If Matteo had moved against the Don, it meant the entire Russo syndicate was currently tearing itself apart in a bloody civil war. And Dominic had brought Ground Zero straight into her living room. "What did he give you?" Rose demanded, her fingers immediately dropping to his wrist to check his radial pulse. It was erratic, a dangerous, galloping rhythm that felt like a bird trapped in a cage. "Dominic, look at me. What were the symptoms? When did you drink it?" "An hour ago," he whispered, his eyelids drooping. "Continental Hotel. Private room. Tasted like almonds. Bitter. Legs went numb. Fought my way to the car. Drove here. Cyanide laced with a heavy narcotic." Rose thought, her mind racing. The alcohol was likely a cover to mask the smell and taste, and the narcotic was meant to slow his heart rate to ensure the poison took hold, without him putting up a fight. The fact that his massive frame and sheer willpower had kept him alive this long was a medical anomaly. "Stay awake," Rose ordered, her voice cracking like a whip. She sprinted to her home office, ripping open her locked medical supply cabinet. She grabbed a specialized tox kit she had kept hidden since her ER days, a handful of syringes, and sodium thiosulfate. When she returned to the living room, Dominic was dangerously still. His chest barely rose. "Dominic!" Rose shouted, dropping to her knees beside the sofa. She tore open his ruined dress shirt, popping the expensive pearl buttons, exposing his chest. She found a vein in his arm, tied off a makeshift tourniquet with his silk tie, and pushed the antidote into his bloodstream. For agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The apartment was dead silent, save for the rain lashing against the windows. Rose sat on the floor, her hands trembling, watching the chest of Chicago's most dangerous man. If he died in her apartment, Mateo's cleaners would find her. She would be dead before sunrise. Slowly, agonizingly, Dominic took a ragged, deep breath. The alarming red flush in his face began to subside, replaced by an ashen pallor. His pulse stabilized. He was unconscious, deeply sedated by the remnants of the narcotic, but he was alive. Rose sat back on her heels, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She looked at the man sleeping on her couch. Stripped of his tailored suits and his terrifying reputation, he looked remarkably human. Vulnerable, even. But Rose knew better. Tomorrow, the beast would wake up, and she would be trapped in his cage. The sharp, metallic click of a gun's safety disengaging is a sound that bypasses the logical brain and speaks directly to human instinct. Rose froze in the doorway of her living room. It was 7 a.m. Pale grey morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. She was holding a tray with 2 cups of black coffee, but her eyes were fixed on the black steel of a Glock 19 pointed directly at her chest. Dominic Russo was awake. He was sitting upright on her ruined sofa. The vulnerability of the previous night was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, coiled tension. His grey eyes were clear, sharp as shattered glass, and entirely devoid of warmth. He didn't look like a man who had nearly died of poisoning 8 hours ago. He looked like a predator assessing a threat. "Put the gun down, Dominic," Rose said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline spiking in her veins. "Unless you plan on shooting the woman who just flushed industrial-grade poison out of your system for the second time in 2 years." Dominic stared at her for a long, silent moment. The gun didn't waver. His mind was clearly racing, piecing together the fragmented memories of the night before, the betrayal at the Continental, the drive through the rain, stumbling onto her porch. Slowly, he lowered the weapon, resting it on his thigh. "You're still here," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "This is my apartment. Where else would I be?" Rose walked forward, placing the tray on the glass coffee table. She handed him a mug. "Drink this. It'll help clear the residual fog from the sedatives." Dominic took the mug, his fingers brushing against hers. His skin was still cold. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "You didn't call the police. You didn't call Harrison. If I called the police, your men or Mateo's men would have intercepted the radio chatter. My house would have been riddled with bullets before the first squad car arrived," Rose said coldly, sitting in the armchair opposite him. "You crossed a line last night, Dominic. You brought your war into my home." "I brought myself to the only person in this city I knew wouldn't put a bullet in my head while I slept," Dominic countered, leaning forward. The sheer magnetism of his presence seemed to shrink the room. "Mateo bought off my security detail. He bought off Arthur Pendleton to ensure the police would look the other way when my body was found at the hotel. I had nowhere else to go." "And now what?" Rose demanded, crossing her arms defensively. "You're alive. You're sober. Get out. Go reclaim your throne. Or go to ground. But leave me out of it." Dominic set the coffee mug down. He looked around the cozy, fiercely normal apartment. At the framed photos of Rose's sister on the mantelpiece, the stack of medical journals on the side table. "I can't do that, Rose." "Excuse me?" "Mateo is thorough," Dominic said, his tone chillingly matter-of-fact. "He knew I managed to get to my car. He has the city locked down. Every private clinic, every back-alley doctor on the payroll is being watched. It won't take his trackers long to pull the city traffic cameras and trace my route." Rose's blood ran cold. "You made sure you weren't followed." "I was dying, Rose. I was driving half blind through a thunderstorm," Dominic said softly. He stood up, buttoning his ruined shirt, his imposing figure towering over her. "They will find this place, and when they do, Matteo will assume you are an ally to my faction. He leaves no loose ends." "No," Rose whispered, standing up, panic finally breaking through her stoic facade. "No, I am a civilian. I have nothing to do with your family. In my world, there are no civilians. Only assets and liabilities." Dominic stepped closer, stopping just inches from her. She could smell the coffee and the faint, metallic scent of the danger that always clung to him. "Right now, to Matteo, you are a liability." Before Rose could formulate a response, the sound of tires screeching violently against wet asphalt echoed from the street outside. Dominic's demeanor instantly shifted. He snatched the Glock from the table, motioning for Rose to stay down. He moved silently to the front window, peeling back a fraction of the blind. Rose crouched behind the armchair, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who is it?" she breathed. "3 black SUVs, Dominic replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned back to her, slipping a spare magazine from his jacket pocket and slapping it into the grip of the pistol. "Matteo's executioners. They found the car." "My God," Rose choked out, looking around her sanctuary, realizing it was about to become a war zone. "My neighbors..." "Forget the neighbors. They're here for us." Dominic grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the house. "Do you have a car in the alley?" "Yes. An old Volvo," Rose said, her mind struggling to keep up with the sudden escalation. "Give me the keys," Dominic demanded. "We are leaving. Now." "We?" Rose yanked her arm out of his grip, staring at him in horror. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Dominic stopped, turning to face her fully. The sounds of heavy, booted footsteps could be heard rushing up her front porch steps. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw. His touch was firm, possessive, and entirely uncompromising. "Listen to me very carefully, Rose," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "If you stay here, you die in about 30 seconds. If you come with me, I swear on my life, I will protect you. But your old life, it's over. The moment I walked through that door, you became mine to protect." The front door exploded inward with a deafening crash, splintering wood flying into the hallway. "Run!" Dominic roared, raising his weapon and firing 2 precise shots toward the front hallway. Rose didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted toward the back door, plunging headfirst into the terrifying, violent world of Dominic Russo. The back alley was a canyon of shadows and relentless rain. Rose's boots slipped on the wet cobblestones as she sprinted toward her 10-year-old Volvo station wagon, the deafening cracks of Dominic's Glock echoing against the brick walls behind her. She didn't look back. The raw instinct to survive overrode the logical, terrifying reality that her quiet, meticulously rebuilt life was currently being shot to pieces in her living room. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so violently she dropped them into a puddle. A massive, warm hand clamped over hers, snatching the keys from the freezing water. Dominic shoved her toward the driver's side door. "Get in and drive," he barked, his voice carrying over the thunder and gunfire. "Don't turn on the headlights until we hit the main street." Rose threw herself into the driver's seat. Dominic practically dived into the passenger side, pulling the door shut just as the back door of her brownstone burst open. 2 men in tactical gear spilled into the alley. The Volvo's engine roared to life, a reliable, heavy rumble that contrasted sharply with the sleek, silent luxury cars Dominic usually traveled in. "Go!" Dominic yelled, rolling down his window. Rose slammed the car into reverse, tires shrieking against the wet pavement as she backed blindly out of the alley. Glass shattered behind them. A bullet spiderwebbed the rear windshield, a terrifyingly loud thwack that made Rose scream, ducking her head. Dominic leaned out the window, firing 3 rapid suppressed shots into the darkness. The pursuing footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a wet thud. She slammed the gearshift into drive and floored the accelerator, rocketing onto a deserted side street. "Head for the Dan Ryan Expressway," Dominic instructed, breathing heavily as he sank back into the leather seat. He ejected the spent magazine and slapped a fresh one in with practiced, terrifying efficiency. "Drive the speed limit. The last thing we need is a patrol car pulling us over." For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the car were the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers and the ragged breathing of its occupants. Rose's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Her scrubs was soaked, clinging to her freezing skin, but she couldn't stop shivering from the adrenaline. "You're bleeding," she said suddenly, her clinical eye catching a dark, expanding stain on the left sleeve of his ruined Brioni shirt. Dominic glanced down at his bicep, his expression entirely indifferent. Ricochet. Or a graze. It missed the bone. Apply pressure, Rose ordered, her voice trembling but authoritative. There's a clean towel in the glove compartment. Dominic opened the compartment, pulling out the folded white towel, but he didn't immediately press it to his arm. Instead, he looked at her. In the harsh, intermittent glow of the passing streetlights, his grey eyes were impossibly intense. He was a man who had just been poisoned, betrayed by his closest friend, and nearly assassinated, yet the only thing he seemed focused on was the woman behind the wheel. "I'm sorry about your house, Rose," he said quietly. A hysterical, choked laugh escaped her lips. "You're sorry about my house? Dominic, you just dragged me into a mob war. Matteo's men just shot out my rear window. I can never go back there. I can't go to my clinic. I don't even have my purse." "I will replace everything," he stated firmly. "Every piece of furniture, the car, the clinic, all of it." "You can't replace my life," Rose snapped, tears of pure frustration finally spilling over her eyelashes. She hastily wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I spent 2 years looking over my shoulder after I pulled that bullet out of you. 2 years jumping at shadows. I finally started to feel safe, and you bring the devil right to my doorstep." "I brought the devil because I knew you were the only angel who could fight him off," Dominic replied, his voice dropping an octave, rich and dangerously smooth. "You saved my life. Again. That makes twice, Dr. Bennett. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Rose gripped the wheel tighter, her heart fluttering traitorously at his words. She hated him for destroying her peace, but sitting beside him, inhaling the scent of rain, gunpowder, and the faint, lingering hint of expensive cedar cologne, she felt an undeniable, magnetic pull. "Where are we going?" she asked, forcing her tone back to icy professionalism. "Take the exit for Interstate 90. We're heading to Rockford," Dominic said, pressing the towel to his bleeding arm. "An old associate of my father's, Arthur Penhaligon, owns a hunting cabin off the grid near the state line. Matteo doesn't know about it. It's been empty for a decade. And what happens when we get there? We patch my arm. We wait for the sun to rise." Dominic looked out the passenger window into the black, stormy night. The ruthless syndicate boss was back, calculating and cold. "And then I figure out how to dismantle Matteo's empire brick by bloody brick." The hunting cabin was exactly as Dominic described, off the grid, incredibly dusty and completely isolated. Nestled deep within a dense thicket of towering pine trees, it smelled of stale wood smoke and old pine needles. There was no electricity, only a half-filled cord of firewood on the porch and a dozen kerosene lanterns scattered around the single, large room. It was 4 a.m. by the time Rose finally got a fire roaring in the massive stone hearth. The warmth slowly crept through the freezing cabin, casting long, dancing, amber shadows against the log walls. Dominic was sitting shirtless on a heavy, distressed leather armchair near the fire, a bottle of cheap whiskey he'd found in the pantry resting on his thigh. He wasn't drinking it, he was using it to sterilize his arm. Rose approached him holding a rudimentary first aid kit she had scrounged from the Volvo's trunk. "Let me see it," she demanded softly. Dominic didn't argue. He leaned back, allowing her to step between his parted knees to get a better angle at his left bicep. The proximity was immediate and overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His chest, sculpted and littered with the faded, pale scars of a violent life, rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Rose poured a splash of the whiskey over the wound. Dominic didn't even flinch, though his jaw muscles feathered. It was a clean graze, but deep enough to require stitches. "I only have butterfly closures and medical tape," Rose murmured, her fingers deftly cleaning the congealed blood with a piece of gauze. "It's going to scar." "Add it to the collection," Dominic replied, his gaze fixed upward on her face. Rose focused entirely on her task, acutely aware that his eyes were tracing the curve of her jaw, the messy dampness of her hair, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration. "You have an impressive pain tolerance," she noted, taping the closure tight. "Comes with the territory," he said. He reached up with his uninjured arm, his fingertips lightly brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The touch was electric. Rose froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Why did you really come to me, Dominic?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper in the quiet cabin. "Don't give me the line about me being the only doctor you trust. You have a dozen back alley surgeons on retainer. You could have gone to any of them." Dominic let his hand drop, but he didn't break eye contact. The flickering firelight illuminated the harsh, beautiful angles of his face. For the first time since she had met him, the Mafia boss looked entirely undefended. Because they are on payroll. You aren't, he confessed quietly. Because for the last 2 years, I haven't been able to get the memory of your hands out of my head. Because every time my world got too dark, I sent Lorenzo to check on you, just to make sure you were safe. Rose stepped back, dropping the roll of medical tape on the side table. You had me followed? Protected, Dominic corrected, his tone hardening slightly. Matteo always wondered why I let the civilian surgeon live after the warehouse. He thought you were a loose end. I told him you were handled. But lately, Matteo has been ambitious. I suspected he might try to use you as leverage against me. So you coming to my house tonight, Rose trailed off, the pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Was a desperate gamble, Dominic admitted, leaning forward. When the poison hit me, I knew Matteo was making his move. I knew he would immediately send a team to your house to secure you, either to torture you for information or to kill you to hurt me. I didn't drive to your house just for an antidote, Rose. I drove there to get you out. Rose stared at him, her chest heaving. The sheer audacity, the possessive arrogance of the man was infuriating. Yet, underneath the anger, a terrifying thrill rushed through her blood. He had dragged himself through hell, dying of cyanide poisoning, to ensure she didn't fall into the hands of his enemies. Before Rose could process the magnitude of his confession, a burner phone Dominic had retrieved from a hidden floorboard in the cabin buzzed violently on the coffee table. Dominic snatched it up. He didn't say hello. He just listened. Rose watched as the vulnerability vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of cold, murderous rage. Are you certain? Dominic asked the caller, his voice like cracking ice. A pause. Understood. Keep your head down, Lorenzo. Wait for my signal. Dominic ended the call and tossed the plastic phone onto the sofa. He looked at Rose, and there was a dark, dangerous pity in his eyes. What is it? Rose asked, her stomach plummeting. That was Lorenzo Rossi? The only capo I have left who isn't on Matteo's payroll, Dominic said slowly. He just pulled the security logs from the precinct. The police precinct? Why? Because Matteo didn't find your address by tracking my car tonight, Dominic stepped toward her, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. He already had a team waiting 2 blocks from your brownstone. They were tipped off. By who? Rose demanded, stepping back until her spine hit the edge of the stone fireplace. Detective Harrison, Dominic said bluntly. Rose felt the breath knocked out of her lungs. No. Harrison is a good cop. He's my friend. He helped me set up my private practice when I left the ER. Harrison has been taking bribes from Matteo's faction for 6 months, Dominic said, his voice ruthless in its delivery of the truth. He sold your address to Matteo for $50,000. He knew exactly who you were, Rose. He was the one who was going to clean up the crime scene after Matteo's men murdered you. The betrayal hit Rose like a physical blow. The one person in law enforcement she had trusted, the man she had almost called instead of opening the door to Dominic, had sold her out to be slaughtered. Her knees buckled slightly, but Dominic was there instantly, his strong arms catching her, pulling her flush against his solid, warm chest. She didn't fight him this time. She gripped his shoulders, burying her face in the crook of his neck as a single, ragged sob tore from her throat. Dominic's arms wrapped tightly around her, one hand tangling in her hair, pressing her closer. I told you, he murmured against her ear, his breath hot and fiercely protective. Your old life is gone. They burned it down. But I promise you, Rose, we are going to burn them down with it. For 48 hours, the hunting cabin in Rockford became a sanctuary suspended in time. Outside, the storm raged, mirroring the violent upheaval occurring within the Chicago underworld. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing between Rose and Dominic. The boundaries between the trauma surgeon and the syndicate boss had blurred entirely, melting away in the heat of the stone hearth and the sheer, undeniable gravity of their shared survival. Dominic's recovery was a testament to his sheer, terrifying willpower. By the second evening, the pallor had left his skin, replaced by a dangerous, predatory vitality. Rose watched him field-hushed, encrypted calls with Lorenzo, his tone clipped and lethal. He was orchestrating a war from a dusty leather armchair, a king piecing his shattered chessboard back together. But Rose was no longer a passive observer. The revelation of Detective Harrison's betrayal had fundamentally altered her. The quiet, compliant doctor who had tried to hide in her pristine brownstone was dead, murdered by the realization that playing by the rules in a rigged game only made you a target. Harrison won't stop looking for me, Rose said softly, breaking the heavy silence of the cabin on the third morning. She was sitting at the scarred wooden dining table, methodically disassembling and cleaning the spare Glock 19 Dominic had given her. It was a terrifyingly intimate act, learning the mechanics of a weapon from the man who had brought the violence to her door. Dominic paused. A topographical map of Chicago spread out before him. He looked up, his grey eyes catching the morning light. He won't have the chance. Lorenzo has a team tracking his cruiser. By midnight, Harrison will be a memory. No, Rose said, the metallic snick of the slide snapping back into place, punctuating her word. She met his gaze, her expression hardening into something that mirrored his own ruthlessness. If Harrison thinks I'm still a terrified civilian, he'll be careless. Mateo is locked away in his penthouse at the Gold Coast, surrounded by guards. You can't get to him without starting a bloodbath that the FBI will have to notice. But Harrison? He operates in the open. Dominic's brow furrowed, a mix of apprehension and dark fascination crossing his features. What are you suggesting, Rose? I'm suggesting we use his greed against him, she replied, standing up and crossing the room. Harrison sold me out for $50,000. He thinks I'm a loose end. If I tell him I escaped you and I'm hiding, terrified and alone, he won't send Mateo's men. He'll come himself to finish the job and claim the credit. Absolutely not, Dominic growled, surging to his feet. In 2 strides, he was in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders. I didn't drag you out of that house to use you as bait. It's too dangerous. It's the only clean way to draw him out and get Mateo's security codes, Rose insisted, refusing to back down. She stepped closer, closing the sliver of space between them. She placed her hands flat against his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thud of his heart. Dominic, you told me my old life is gone. You were right. Let me help you secure the new one. Dominic stared down at her, the fierce, protective anger in his eyes warring with a profound, overwhelming awe. He raised a hand, his knuckles gently grazing the line of her cheekbone. If anything happens to you, Rose, I will burn this city to the bedrock. Then make sure nothing happens to me, she whispered. The trap was set for 11 p.m. at an abandoned shipping yard in Joliet, far enough from Mateo's territory to make Harrison feel secure. The air was frigid, the ground slick with patches of black ice. Rose stood beneath a flickering sodium street lamp, shivering violently in an oversized wool coat, playing the part of the desperate survivor to perfection. 15 minutes later, an unmarked black Dodge Charger rolled into the yard, its headlights cutting through the freezing fog. The driver's door opened, and Detective Harrison stepped out. He was a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled trench coat, his face cast in deep shadows. He kept his right hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. Rose, Harrison called out, his voice laced with a sickeningly faux concern. He walked slowly toward her, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Jesus, kid, you look awful. I got your message. Where's Russo? I lost him near Elgin, Rose lied, forcing her voice to tremble. She wrapped her arms around herself. He was bleeding out. I ran. Harrison, I didn't know who else to call. You have to help me. You did the right thing, Rose, Harrison said, closing the distance until he was only 5 feet away. A cold, ugly smirk slowly twisted his lips. He drew his weapon, leveling it directly at her chest, but you really should have kept driving. Mateo doesn't like loose ends, and frankly, neither do I. Why, Harrison? Rose asked, her voice steadying entirely, dropping the terrified facade. Was the $50,000 really worth my life, worth everything I did for the precinct at Northwestern Memorial? Harrison chuckled, clicking off the safety. It wasn't just 50 grand, sweetheart. With Russo dead, Mateo takes the throne. And who do you think Mateo promised the chief of police position to? I'm cleaning up the streets, Rose. I'm just starting with the trash. You always did have a grand sense of your own importance, Detective. The voice, deep and resonant with lethal promise, echoed from the darkness behind Harrison. Before Harrison could pivot, Dominic stepped from the shadows of a rusted shipping container. He moved with the terrifying speed of an apex predator. His arms swung out, the heavy steel of his customized 1911 pistol connecting violently with the back of Harrison's skull. Harrison crumpled to the icy asphalt with a sharp cry, his gun clattering away into the dark. Dominic was on him in an instant, a heavy leather boot planted firmly on the detective's spine, pinning him to the frozen ground. Lorenzo and 3 other heavily armed men emerged from the periphery, securing the yard. Russo! Harrison spat blood onto the ice, his voice tight with panic. You're supposed to be dead. I have an excellent doctor, Dominic said coldly. He pressed the barrel of his gun into the back of Harrison's neck. You have 10 seconds to give me the private elevator bypass code for Matteo's penthouse. If you lie, I'll let Lorenzo practice his carving skills on your kneecaps. Harrison broke in 5 seconds. He rattled off the numeric code, begging for his life, promising to turn state's evidence against Matteo. Dominic didn't say a word. He looked up at Rose, who stood perfectly still, watching the man who had sold her soul beg in the dirt. Do it, Rose said softly, the words hanging in the freezing air like a death sentence. Dominic's eyes flared with a dark, consuming fire. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he stepped back and nodded to Lorenzo. Tie him up. Drop him off at the FBI field office with the ledgers we took from his safe. Let him rot in a federal cell. Dominic turned and walked toward Rose. The violence of the moment faded as he reached her, pulling her into his chest. It's time to end this, he murmured. The raid on the Gold Coast penthouse was a masterclass in silent, brutal efficiency. Armed with Harrison's codes, Dominic and his loyalists bypassed Matteo's multi-million-dollar security system. Rose waited in the armored SUV parked in the alley below, her heart hammering against her ribs, her fingers tightly gripping the handle of her Glock. 20 agonizing minutes passed. Then the heavy steel door of the alleyway burst open. Dominic stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. His suit was ruined once again, spattered with dark stains that weren't his own, but his posture was victorious. The usurper was dead. The throne was reclaimed. He walked over to the SUV and pulled the passenger door open. He looked at Rose, his grey eyes devoid of the coldness he reserved for his enemies. They were burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. It's done, Dominic said, his chest heaving slightly. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. Matteo is gone, the syndicate is mine again, and Harrison is caged. And what about me, Dominic? Rose whispered, her hands reaching up to grip the lapels of his ruined jacket. What happens to the doctor who knows too much? Dominic cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing over her cheekbones. The scent of gunpowder and cedar enveloped her, a scent that now meant safety, power, and an intoxicating, dangerous love. The doctor is dead, Dominic declared, his lips hovering mere millimeters from hers. But the Queen of Chicago, her reign begins tonight. If you want it, if you want me. Rose looked into the eyes of the monster who had dismantled her world, only to build her a stronger, darker one. She didn't hesitate. She pulled him down, capturing his lips in a bruising, desperate kiss that sealed her fate forever. She tasted blood, rain, and the intoxicating flavor of absolute devotion. She had lost her quiet, peaceful life, but in the arms of Dominic Russo, she had found her kingdom. Rose's peaceful existence as a trauma surgeon was permanently shattered the night a poisoned Mafia boss stumbled onto her porch. Forced into a violent underworld of betrayal, she abandoned her oath to do no harm, choosing instead to survive alongside the ruthless predator who swore to protect her. In the ashes of her old life, Rose didn't just find sanctuary, she found her dark, intoxicating throne.